And we're going to open our Bibles to 1 Peter chapter 3. 1 Peter chapter 3, if you want to use the Bible that I'll be using this morning, you can find it in the pew in front of you, page 1048. Sometimes when you hear a sermon or you hear some kind of Bible teaching and you learn an important principle, you walk away thinking, that was really helpful and I like it and it sounds important, but I really don't know how to put that to work in my life. What's that supposed to look like in my situation? Sometimes what we have to do is we have to take truth and bring it down a few levels of what they call the ladder of abstraction and put it in a really concrete situation so we know what to do with it. This morning, Peter's going to do that for us. We've been working our way through the book of 1 Peter, and we're reaching a point where Peter has been teaching a very important principle, and this morning what he's going to do, he's going to apply it to a very concrete, personal situation. The big idea that Peter has been promoting, that he's been teaching, that he's been reminding believers is that we are to live such good lives among the pagans. We are God's people. Because we're God's people, we are to live in a unique way even among pagans, even among people who don't know God, even among people who've never acknowledged who Jesus is and what he's done for them, that we are to live such good lives even in those contexts, that those pagans will see our good works and become aware of who God is and what he's done for them. And we understand that that is challenging because when we live in a Jesus way, we risk further mistreatment. The people in 1 Peter, the people that Peter is writing to, they have been misrepresented and misunderstood by the very pagans that Peter is saying, I want you to live good lives among these people. They've been mistreated, they've been misrepresented, and Peter still says to them, listen, I know that following Jesus in the relationships around you is challenging. I want you to do it anyway. And then he even adds to that, he says, I want you to do it even if it leads to further suffering. I want you to do the Jesus thing in every situation and just trust the just judge with the result. That's the message that Peter's wanting to communicate to these believers in the first century and to us today. That we do the Jesus thing in every situation and just trust the just judge with the result. And that's tough. It's especially tough among pagans. Pagans, people who don't acknowledge God and don't aspire to live according to Jesus' way of life, the pattern of life that Jesus gave. We learned in Titus last year that Cretans are going to Crete. Pagans are going to be pagans. And sometimes even, I don't know if you know this, but sometimes even Christians act like pagans. Maybe you've noticed. And that makes it difficult to do the Jesus thing in those situations. But Peter calls on Jesus himself, exhibit A of how to respond to unjust suffering. He calls on the example of Jesus and he says we are called to live in the very same way as Jesus, who when he was taken advantage of, continued to give of himself. When he was mistreated, he didn't respond in kind. Instead, he modeled what he taught. Jesus loved his enemies, and he blessed those who cursed them. And Peter says, I want you to do the same, even though you live among pagans. We hear that, we're like, okay. But what about that one pagan? You know the pagan I'm talking about. The pagan who leaves their socks in the living room floor every day, like no one else lives in that house. What about that pagan? The pagan who never squeegees the shower when they're done. The pagan who, when we're in a hurry to get someplace, drives like an old lady. What about that pagan? You know the one I'm talking about. I'm talking about your spouse. Now, I'm being facetious when I call your spouse a pagan. I'm being facetious. But in some cases, some of us actually do live with someone who's not a believer. So we're going to address that situation this morning. But in most cases, we live with someone who's a Jesus follower along with us. But even that has its own challenges. Sometimes you might feel like you live with a person who acts like a pagan. And you're like, it's their turn to say, I'm sorry. I'm not going to say I'm sorry. It's their turn to wash the dishes. I don't care if that sink fills up till it blocks the refrigerator door. I am not going to do the dishes. I don't care. I am not going to be the first one to smile and be polite after our argument. I'm going to let them do it because I'm always the first one to do it. We live with someone who challenges us, and we experience what we think of as unjust suffering, even in the context of our marriage, and that's what we're going to talk about this morning. Now, you may not be married this morning, and you may be living with someone, or not living with someone, you don't have a spouse, but you still, even if you're not married, you still have your own, I'll bet, your own personal pagan somewhere. That person you're in close relationship with who is prickly as a porcupine and hard to act like Jesus around. And so all of us can benefit from what Peter has to say, because he's going to take his idea of doing the Jesus thing in every situation and just trust God with the results, and he's going to apply it to marriage. And you'll see in this case, even marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. So let's see what Peter has to say about this as he applies his idea to husbands and wives. This is 1 Peter 3, chapter 1. Chapter 3, verse 1. Wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they're unbelievers. If any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past, who put their hope in God, used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. This passage has a key phrase that appears 2 times. And when you approach this passage, it's important, first of all, to understand this key phrase. The key phrase is found in verse 1 and verse 7. And this phrase governs how you approach this whole passage. And the phrase is, in the same way. Paul addresses husbands and wives with this key phrase, in the same way. It's in verse 1, wives in the same way, and it's in verse 7, husbands in the same way. So the key to understanding this passage is to understand what is the same way that Peter is talking about here. What is he talking about? He's talking about everything he's brought up to this point about what it means to be in a relationship with someone and you experience suffering and disadvantage. And he's saying, in the same way as just above this passage, he uses Jesus' example of someone who endured unfair suffering. Verse 21, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. In the same way that Jesus entrusted himself to him who judges justly, even though he was at significant disadvantage, wives, husbands, respond to each other in that same way. Be willing to endure unfair suffering, just like Jesus, even in your marriage relationship. So Jesus is an example. Jesus is one of the things that Peter's referring to. He's also saying in the same way as slaves in verse 18. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. Husbands, wives, in the same way as Jesus, in the same way as I'm asking slaves to live and just do the Jesus thing in every situation, same way as Jesus, same way as slaves, I want you to do the Jesus thing in every situation, including your marriage. And then one final point of context is in chapter 2, verse 12. In the same way as what? Well, in the same way as I said in chapter 2, verse 12, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. I think of this as a big funnel that starts in chapter 2, verse 12, that verse that we just read. Live such good lives among the pagans. It's a big funnel. And that's the first part of the funnel. And then next he addresses slaves, and that's the next part of the funnel. And then he says, just like Jesus, this is what you were called to do as well, to suffer unjustly, to live good lives among the pagans. And then he applies it to marriage, husbands and wives. And his point here is do the Jesus thing in every situation, in the same way as Jesus himself, and just trust the just judge with the results. And he is challenging believers to do this in a very difficult context, because many of the believers that he's addressing here are what we would call unequally yoked. Unequally yoked, that's kind of Christianese for marriage between a believer and an unbeliever. And Peter acknowledges, especially in the case of wives here, that they are married to unbelievers. They're genuinely married to pagans. People who have not repented, not turned to Jesus as the one God sent. And so this is a challenging situation. In the same way that he says to slaves, submit to masters who are good and masters who are harsh, Peter's challenging wives to do the Jesus thing with spouses who are pagan, and indirectly challenging husbands to do the Jesus thing with wives who may not be believers. So we're talking about a challenging context in which Peter wants these believers and wants us to apply this principle. We're not talking about putting this principle to work in a perfect marriage. There's no perfect marriage. We're talking about putting this principle to work even in difficult relationships, even when you're sure you're getting the short end of the stick. That's the challenge. And he says to wives, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands. Submit yourselves to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. Peter challenges wives, even wives married to unbelievers, to continue to do the Jesus thing and to live in a way that is submissive to their husbands. And he unpacks what submissive means when he talks about purity and reverence of life. That these are women who live in circumstances that are difficult, Women in Peter's day didn't have the same kinds of options and legal recourse and economic escape hatches and at least other opportunities as women do today. So very constricting, challenging situation. And Peter says, even if you live in a situation like that and there's nothing you can do to change it, live in a way that reflects your Christo formation, that reflects gentleness and purity of life. And then he goes on to talk about, in verse 3, your beauty should not come from outward adornment. And he goes on to list these ways that elaborate hairstyles, the wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Peter's not railing against those things. He's just saying, listen, that's not where your beauty is going to come from. That's not where you're not going to win your husband over by and his faith by your outward beauty. He says, listen, your beauty comes from your inward behavior, not your outward dress. It's your inward behavior that's beautiful and is going to win your husband. It should rather, verse 4 says, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit. Notice what Peter calls beautiful here. And there's a little bit of context. There's definitely some historic and some cultural, social context that is informing this that we can't relate to in the 21st century. But he's saying, listen, this gentle and quiet spirit, this purity and reverence, that's where your true beauty comes, in your relationship with God. He says at the very end of verse 4, which is of great worth in God's sight. Notice here that the wife in this marriage relationship is aware of what's beautiful in God's sight. This is her just judge. And she is aware of the just judge and what the just judge values. And she wants to live in a way that reflects these values. And so Peter challenges the wife in this relationship, even if it leads to unjust suffering, which I'll address in just a minute, even if it leads to unjust suffering, that you're to do the Jesus thing in that relationship. Now, he says something to husbands. Verse 7, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner. The idea for husbands here is he wants husbands to treat their wives, believing and unbelieving wives, with sensitivity and honor. Sensitivity, that's that very first phrase. In the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. The Greek phrase is literally live with your wife according to knowledge. That's the idea. That's where the word considerate comes from. Live with your spouse according to knowledge. That means you need to live with your wife in a way that reflects your understanding of her unique makeup. She is not one of the guys. Don't treat her like one of the guys. Live with her according to knowledge. She's not one of the other girls either. So don't treat her like that. Become a student of your wife. Become a student of her needs. Become a student of her makeup. And treat her accordingly. Live with your wives according to knowledge, sensitivity, awareness of their unique makeup. And in sensitivity, live with your wives according to knowledge, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and heirs with you of the gracious gift of God. When Peter calls wives a weaker partner here, he's not calling you a lesser person. He's not talking about you as women as lesser. He's just really, I think, his point of reference here is physical strength. That as women, you don't have physical strength in the relationship. You don't bring physical intimidation into the relationship. And Peter is reminding husbands that they do. That husbands have size and stature and strength that usually outranks their wives, and they could use that to coerce, they could use that to threaten, they could use that to intimidate, and they could use that to bully. And Peter says, no. You treat your spouse with respect as the weaker partner. You take your extra strength that you bring to the relationship and you use it not to threaten or intimidate or coerce or bully, but you use that extra strength that you bring to serve and to care for the needs of the person that you're living with according to knowledge. You don't use your power as a means for your own benefit. Instead, you treat them with respect and as heirs of the gracious gift of life. This is your sister in Christ. You treat her as an equal. This would have been pretty challenging words in Peter's day to people who were living in the Roman Empire in Asia Minor. These would have been pretty radical ways of thinking about your spouse, for a man to think of his wife as an equal partner. But Peter says, listen, you are to live with your wives in a considerate way. You are to be respectful and use your strength to serve, to give and not to get. Even if that means you might get the short end of the stick in that relationship. Just do the Jesus thing in every circumstance and just trust the just judge with the results. So hear these words to wives: let your inner beauty, not your outward dress, but your inner beauty, what compels your husband. And husbands, let your strength be used to serve and honor your wife. In this, we kind of put this together. It's interesting, the person without power, the spouse in this case, especially in first century Rome, less so today, but certainly in first century Rome, the person without power is still called on. The person without power is still called on to respond in a Jesus way. And the person with power is called on to use that power in a serving way. And Peter says this is important because how you do this and whether you do this has eternal significance, eternal, lasting implications. There are eternal implications to how we conduct ourselves in unjust situations, even in our marriages. Wives, you can behave in a way, our passage tells us, so that if any of your husbands, verse 1, do not believe the word, they may be won over by the behavior of their wives. There is eternal significance to how we conduct ourselves in marriage relationships, such that even an unbelieving husband, a wife could live such a beautiful life among her personal pagan that he would see her good works, not even hear her words, but just see the beauty and reverence of her and be convinced that Jesus is who he says he is. The same is true for husbands. Husbands can live in a way with an unbelieving wife, such that they see your good works and glorify God on the day he visits us. Because that person, that unbelieving spouse, they may be your closest pagan, but that also means you're their closest Christian. And you're the person whose life through which they are going to be able to see the reality of Jesus at work. So there's eternal significance. On the one end, you can win your spouse over. It's not a guarantee. It's not a guarantee, but it's a possibility. And if you can have that kind of impact on an unbelieving spouse by being willing to suffer sometimes, to suffer injustice, how much more can you contribute to the Christo formation of your believing spouse by doing the same thing? So on the one hand, there's something we can accomplish in a positive way, and on the other hand, there's something we can avoid. Peter says, to husbands particularly, I want you to treat your wives in a certain way so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Peter says, listen, it's possible to be so at odds with your spouse that it means you're at odds with God as well. It's possible to be so out of sorts with your spouse that it puts your relationship with God out of sorts, and He doesn't hear your prayers until you deal with that first. Because when you go to God and pray, you're asking Him to treat you in a certain way, and He says, well, I want to see you treat your spouse that way. If you want me to treat you that way, forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. So we're reminded that how we conduct ourselves, even in the very close context of a marriage relationship, has eternal significance. And this is all really challenging for us to hear. I know that it is. Because we can all think of situations in our marriage relationships where you feel from time to time maybe you've been treated unfairly. Eugene Peterson says that marriage is graduate school for spirituality. So we get that, right? And if you're not married, God has another graduate school for you with that other pagan who challenges your behavior, challenges your ability to respond like Jesus would. Those are circumstances that God allows in our lives to grow us in the likeness of Jesus. There are plenty of opportunities. There are plenty of opportunities in your marriage for you to endure unjust suffering or refuse. There are plenty of opportunities for you to keep score, get even, retaliate, or love, serve, forgive, go first. And how we respond in these situations, in the very micro situation of our marriages, has eternal ramifications for our spouse's spiritual development and for our own relationship with God. So the challenge that Peter brings to us today is the challenge to bring this principle, do the Jesus thing in every situation, and just trust the just judge with the result. He wants us to bring that into our marriages or into our relationship with our closest pagan, whoever that might be. Even in those situations, there are opportunities for God to be at work in the lives of the other person and in our own lives. Now, there may be a context where what I don't want you to hear this morning is that I need to put up with anything I get from my spouse. Anything they dish out, I guess I just have to take it. I don't want you to hear that. If you're in a situation where you are experiencing abuse of multiple kinds, any kind, then there are other options and other things that you need to bring into bear. There are other biblical principles that need to govern how you respond. So that's a complicated situation. And I don't want anyone to hear, if there's anyone here who's experiencing abuse from their spouse, I don't want you to hear that what my church told me is go back home and just suck it up. If that's your situation, I want you to let us know so that we can help you and give you wisdom and guidance on how to respond in that situation. And when we talk about marriage, all of us, we all have, those of us who've been married, we can go lots of different directions with that. We may have a whole life of regrets. I want us to think less about all those regrets and more about the situation that you're in right now and how God would have you to respond. And wouldn't it be amazing if, even in the context of our marriage, we always do the Jesus thing and trust the just judge with the results. Next week, I'm going to read these words. It's the very next verse. If you still have your Bibles open, verse 8. Next week, we'll read these words. Finally, all of you be like-minded, be sympathetic, love one another, be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. When I read those words next week and we think in the context of our faith family, we're going to just think, oh, that's so wonderful. That's the kind of church I want to be part of, where we love one another and we're compassionate and humble. Here's what I want to do this morning. I want us to take these words and think of, what if we brought this into our marriage? Let me read this passage one more time and we'll close. I want you to think about just the warm fuzzies of the church body. But I want us to bring these very same qualities into our relationship with our spouse. Finally, all of you, husbands and wives, be like-minded. Be sympathetic. Love one another. Be compassionate and humble. Do not repay evil with evil, insult with insult. On the contrary, we repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit blessing. Let's pray. Father, these are challenging words, because daily life with another person brings so many opportunities for us to feel neglected, offended, insulted, ignored, misunderstood. Even the healthiest relationships sometimes produce these kinds of feelings. Some of us here are not in the healthiest of relationships. We're in challenging situations. We really need your help. We really need you to show us what it looks like and what it means to do the Jesus thing in these situations. For the most part, we live with reasonable people who also want to follow you. Help us to treat one another as co-heirs of the grace that Jesus has offered to us. And in this closest of relationships, to really model the kind of love that you have shown us. I pray for wives here this morning that you will strengthen them in their relationship with their husbands, that they can live with them in a way that reflects grace and beauty and purity and their reverence for you. And for husbands, that we can love our wives with understanding, with strength, with gentleness, with care and a heart to serve. And for those who aren't married, that you'll cultivate these qualities in them through other relationships. And you remind all of us that how we treat our closest pagans has eternal significance. Pray that you'll give us what we need for this. We ask it in your Son's name. Amen.